Sometimes things get a new purpose in life. We might have something that we use a lot, and then our situation changes and we don't use it anymore and put it away. But then later on, we might rediscover it and find a new use for it. An example of that might be what in the United States is called a bathtub Madonna. Some people, especially in the southern United States, when they remodeled their bathrooms, kept the old bathtub. It was still perfectly good, and they just didn't want to throw it away, so they put it in the garage or the barn and just left it. And then someone had an idea, someone who was a good Catholic. They had a statue of Mary, and they thought about making a little shrine using the bathtub as a holder. This is the more basic model. And this is another shrine that's made with a little more care and artistry. In the first reading this weekend, Isaiah is talking about preparing the way of the Lord. He was writing 6 centuries before Jesus, and when he was talking about the coming of the Lord, he wasn't talking about Jesus. He was referring to God coming to save the people of Israel who were captives in Babylon. They had been conquered by the Persians and taken as slaves to Babylon. And now Isaiah the prophet came to say, God is going to lead you back to your home country, back to Jerusalem. When Isaiah spoke those words about the coming of the Lord, referring to God helping them, he was making a reference to what had happened before. He was talking about the coming of God to help the people in Babylon, and that was going to be the second coming. The first coming of God was to Israel at the time of the Exodus. That's when God sent Moses to lead the people from Egypt through the desert into the Promised Land. Now, in our reading today, Isaiah is speaking about the second coming of God, coming to the people of Israel in Babylon. The people are discouraged, in despair, sad and sorrowful, and so he announces good news to them. Comfort, comfort my people, your God is coming to save you. In the gospel reading that we have today, Mark has John the Baptist reusing the words of Isaiah about the second coming, God going to Babylon to save the people. But now, when Mark uses those words, they refer to the coming of the Lord in Jesus in 2,000 years ago. John seems to be expecting and anticipating the day of judgment that was spoken of by the prophets of old. But the rest of Mark's gospel reveals the unfolding story of God's anointed one, the Messiah, Jesus. He was God's third coming. The third coming of God was now in the person of Jesus. And he was different from the powerful figures who had come to lead Israel out of Egypt and to lead Israel out of Babylon and take them back to Jerusalem. Now, the one coming to them, the coming of God, would be the Messiah. God would come in the person of Jesus, and he would come to teach, to heal, to suffer, and finally to give his life in ransom for others. At the first coming of God to the people, Moses led the Israelites to the Promised Land, and there they established the kingdom of God's chosen people. At the second coming of God spoken of in today's reading, God is coming to the people in Babylon, and now Isaiah says God will lead you back to Israel and you can reestablish the kingdom of God. The reign of God then mentioned in the third reading in the gospel today is about the third coming of God as Jesus the Messiah. And when Jesus comes and starts speaking about the kingdom of God, it's different from what was spoken about before. He redefined the reign of God. He gave it a new meaning. The reign of God that was introduced in the words of John the Baptist and Jesus, it didn't depend upon military leaders or powerful angels to lead people through the desert, or it didn't depend upon the defeat of their enemies or the capture of the lands of their hostile neighbors. Rather, the new kingdom of God, the reign of God introduced by Jesus, was about creating God's family, including all of God's people, recognizing the bonds among us as brothers and sisters, seeing all of us as equals, loving our enemies, forgiving unconditionally, caring for the poor and the marginalized, the least of society. That's the kingdom of God that Jesus left us in his coming as the third coming of God. And we are to continue building up that kingdom. We are to do the same things that Jesus did, to teach, to heal, to suffer, to give up our lives. We do teaching. Some of us are working as teachers in schools. Some of us work in the religious education program as teachers. I teach through homilies. Parents teach their children. Some people have work in projects that have education programs. But all of us teach by our lives. One of my favorite quotes is from a man named Paul Chelo. He says, "The world is changed by your example, not by your opinion." He's talking about our words and our actions. They make a difference. They are what teach people. The second way that Jesus redefined the reign of God was in his healing. And among us, some people might be people who do medical healing in hospitals or clinics. Parents sometimes do healing with their children, taking care of their cuts and bruises. But all of us can do healing. We can give comfort, support, and reassurance, and that's especially important now in this time of pandemic. So many people are going through such a rough time. They're hurting, confused, anxious, disconnected, and our reaching out to them can be real healing. The third way that Jesus helped to redefine the reign of God was through his suffering. Parents suffer a lot when they see their children suffering. And people who are responsible for others, they suffer too when they see their people in distress. Sometimes they can't take away the suffering, they can't stop it, but they can choose to suffer with those people. That's the principle of solidarity. We can't solve everyone's problems. We can't remove all the dangers in life, but we can be with people in their suffering. We can go through that suffering with them, and then they know that they are not alone or abandoned. The fourth way that we can see the reign of God as Jesus defined it was in giving his life for others, and we are called to do that too. Some people are called to give their lives literally. Just this past Wednesday, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the 4 church women in El Salvador who were murdered by the military there because of their work with refugees. And in our day now, we see so many people giving up their lives, people in the medical professions who are working so hard in this COVID epidemic. They're giving up their time with their family, they're giving up vacations, they're giving up their freedom, they're giving up everything. They are so exhausted, so stretched. They're giving up their lives for other people. People who work in some NGOs, they give up a lot to help other people. Some missionaries do that too. And then there are the parents who give up so much of their lives for their children. And then there's the ordinary people who do simple things like buying somebody a meal or making random acts of kindness. They give up something of their lives. They sacrifice for other people. That's building up the reign of God the way Jesus did. We're now in this season of Advent. And Advent is a time for us to reflect and to recognize what do we need to do and how do we act in a different way in order to really make real the reign of God today. If we can do that, if we can reflect really seriously, then Jesus, the Son of God, can enter our lives more completely and can transform us into his disciples and can work through us to really build up the reign of God in our world and in our lives and in our times.